Hello, students, and welcome to week 9 of Nonviolence and Peace Action. This week, we'll be delving into the power of nonviolence. So as you know, the first half of the semester, we looked at all the atrocities that humans commit against each other. This includes interstate war, intrastate war, mass rape, genocide, gross human rights violations. We looked at human security issues. Now we're going to look at ways to combat all these atrocities. And so the first thing we're going to focus on is the power of nonviolence. So as you know, you have to do a screencast assignment, so you know what to do. This year has been very formative in terms of nonviolent protests in our country, especially with the Black Lives Matter movement. So what I'd like you to do is read these articles that you see here, one from the BBC, one from CNET, and one from the Washington Post. Then I would like you to answer these questions after you read those 3 articles. Question 1, why don't most people know the names of the Black Lives Matter leaders? And does it matter? Question 2, what does it say when corporations are supporting nonviolent movements like Black Lives Matter? And number 3, in your opinion, why do you feel there is support for the Black Lives Matter movement, but less support for the removal of Confederate statues and the defunding of police? In your opinion, why do you feel there is support for the Black Lives Matter movement, but less support for the removal of Confederate statues and the defunding of the police? And another article, a very short article, why you should never underestimate a bunch of well-organized teenage protesters. More often than not, you will see young people, especially teens and people in their 20s, join protests. So question 4 is, what are your thoughts about this article? And question 5 is, do you think teenagers are less risk-averse for biological reasons, like the lack of frontal lobe development, or cultural reasons? And justify your answer. And then, in addition, I would like you to watch this video that comes from the BBC called Hard Talk, and they're interviewing an academic named Gene Sharp. And Gene Sharp is known for his research on non-violent protests around the world and has 198 actions that can be taken as a non-violent protester. So watch the video and answer these questions. Question 6. Why does Sharp say that using violence against the regime is a stupid decision? Question 7. What does Sharp say about the importance of planning nonviolent protest? And question 8. The interviewer asked Sharp about dealing with dictators that had popular support, like Hitler. How does Sharp reply? Question 8. The interviewer asked Sharp about dealing with dictators who have popular support, like Hitler. How does Sharp reply? So they're referring to back in the 1940s when Nazism was popular and fascism was popular. So how does Sharp reply to how do you bring down a regime that has popular support? So let's talk a little bit about what nonviolence and passive and active resistance are. Nonviolence is the use of peaceful means, not force, to bring about political or social change. Active resistance are situations in which an individual resists or impedes the actions of a law enforcement officer and comes into physical contact with him in the process. And passive resistance is the act of showing in a peaceful way that you oppose something rather than using violence, a technique of demonstrating opposition to a government's activity simply by not cooperating with them. So nonviolent campaigns have been around before this era, but they were in less numbers. So if you look before 1901, there are 34 cases recorded in history, in Western history, I should say. From 1901 to 1950, you see that there was 107 nonviolent campaigns. From 1951 to 2000, you see that there's 400. And then just from 2001 to 2013, you see that there are 338 and growing. So there's a rise in the use of nonviolent campaigns. This project was started by Swarthmore College in 2010, and there are likely more cases that have yet to be recorded. But I want you to keep this in mind because we're going to be talking extensively about nonviolence for the rest of the semester and its importance. So where does nonviolence come from? There is a definite connection between nonviolence and democracy. So we see a rise of democracy. And then as a result, we see the spread of nonviolence because it's associated with the rise of democracy. So a strong democracy is fundamentally a mechanism for nonviolent conflict resolution. And sorry, I forgot the second quote there. Democracies rely on peaceful methods to resolve internal conflicts, while non-democracies use coercion and violence. Okay, so 90 countries in the world have become democracies. This has been a fourfold increase since 1946. And one of the reasons why there's been a rise of democracy is the rise of the United Nations. Okay, so the United Nations aspires to be a model democratic intergovernmental organization that cooperates among the countries. It was conceived, as you know, after the horrors of World War II. But there are problems associated with the United Nations and the rise of democracy. Okay, so some of these countries that become democracies are not really democratic. And also the United Nations is not also very democratic in some cases because it has a Security Council. And that Security Council is made up of 5 major countries: the United States, United Kingdom, China, Russia, and France. So ultimately, they make the final decisions. So it's partially a democracy, but because we have the Security Council in place that makes the final decision, it's not a true democracy. But the United Nations overall has supported the use of nonviolent social movements. So here's a map of where nonviolent protests and other strategies have taken place in the world. Okay, and you can see this also comes from Swarthmore, who put together the data. Okay. All right. Everyone has heard of Mohandas Gandhi, and we're going to talk a little bit about him because he really kicks off the nonviolent protest movements of the 20th century and has been an inspiration for every nonviolent protest out there. So Mohandas Gandhi went to South Africa in the early 1900s, fighting for a campaign of justice for the Indian minority that was living in South Africa at the time. And in 1915, he returns to India to fight British oppression. He creates a mass movement that focuses first on promoting economic and political equality. Then he fought for independence from England for India. So his most influential nonviolent action is the Salt Satyagraha. So in 1930, Gandhi writes to the authorities that he was going to lead a 240-mile march from his home to the sea. Then he would break the law by harvesting salt from the sea. Gandhi offered to stop the march if the UK would stop taxing the private production of salt, and the authorities obviously ignored him. So Gandhi would walk 24 hours a day, then stop to explain the purpose of his movement to the villages as he went by. This increased his followers, and the press published articles in the newspaper. On April 6, 1930, Gandhi and hundreds of Indians stopped at the shore of the Dandi and broke the law by taking salt and challenged the legitimacy of the government. The authorities did nothing. Gandhi wrote to the authorities again, declaring that he would lead the marchers in seizing the Dharasana salt works. The viceroy ordered their arrest, but the salt works were still seized by other followers. They were beaten and hundreds were arrested, but most importantly, none of them fought back. Even though Gandhi was in jail, this event was the catalyst for many additional nonviolent actions. So it's a very important part of the story here. And other nonviolent actions were taking place after this. What I have here is the clip that describes the planning of the Salt March, and also you see part of the Salt March. So this comes from a movie called Gandhi back in the 1980s, and Ben Kingsley plays Gandhi. So I just want you to watch this very short clip about it. I would like you to take a moment also to read this article called Nonviolent Action and Its Misconceptions, Insights for Social Scientists. Okay, so Kurt Schock is a professor at Rutgers. He writes about social movements, and let's look at the quote that he has here. Nonviolent action is active. It involves activity in the collective pursuit of social or political objectives, and it is nonviolent. It does not involve physical force or the threat of physical force against human beings. And he writes about misconceptions about nonviolence. So question 9 is, what misconceptions did you have about nonviolence before taking this class? For me, I always thought before studying nonviolence and social movements that nonviolent protest was kind of wimpy, right? So that like you're sitting there, maybe you're like going to sit in and you have like your hands joined and you're singing, and but actually it's quite badass for nonviolent protesters and nonviolent action, because in many cases they're often beaten by the police or arrested by the police. They're hurt by the police. So people who get involved in nonviolent protests find that it's violence against them, and the fact that they can stand up to authority by not fighting back it sends a powerful message, right? So you see this in television, or you see it in a movie, that you see they're being brutalized for their cause, and yet they're not fighting back, which gains the sympathy of the public, which helps bring about change. So what misconceptions did you have about nonviolence before taking this class? So here are 8 from the 18 misconceptions of nonviolence, and I'm just going to touch on a couple of them. So number 1, nonviolent action is not inaction. So it's not submissiveness, and it's not the avoidance of conflict, and it's not passive resistance. Okay, so it's active in terms of taking a stand and being able in a group to stand up against the authority. Number 3, nonviolent action is not limited to state-sanctioned political activities. So nonviolent action may be legal or illegal. So for example, civil disobedience is the open and deliberate violation of the law for a collective social or political purpose, and is a fundamental type of nonviolent action. It can include all different kinds of actions, which we're going to talk about in our small group when I see you next. Number 9, those who implement nonviolent action do not assume that the state will not react with violence. So nonviolent actors can, like, they anticipate that they're going to be beaten, they're going to be shot, they're going to be arrested. They anticipate this. So violence is to be expected from the government, especially from non-democratic governments. But as we saw with the Black Lives Matter movement, we also saw police taking violent actions against its own citizens in a democracy. So it happens in democracies as well. Number 13, nonviolent action can be moderate, reformed, or radical. The feminist movement has radically challenged patriarchal gender relations almost entirely through methods that do not involve violence. And challenging groups can be militant, radical, or nonviolent. Take a moment to read the rest of these misconceptions and then go on to the next slide. So let's look at some of the revolutions that have happened in the last 50 years. As I mentioned, Gene Sharp wrote a book called The Politics of Nonviolent Action, and it was published in 1973. And Sharp is one of the most influential actors of nonviolent action. His publications have been influential in the struggles around the world, and this book contains foundational analyses of the nature of political power and of the methods and dynamics of nonviolent action. So we're going to look at some case studies of nonviolence. In Portugal, revolution started as a military coup organized by the armed forces movement, but there were military officers who opposed the regime. So this movement coupled a popular campaign of civil resistance along with the military. The movement would lead to the fall of the government and the withdrawal of Portugal from its African colonies, all through nonviolence. In Argentina, had a conflict back in the late 70s, early 80s. And in that conflict, military officials would go into houses of people who were vocal against the government, and they would literally steal their children. And they would give those children to military personnel and their wives and government officials. They stole thousands of children. So in Argentina, there was a lot of anguish involved with this. So Argentinian mothers and grandmothers whose children disappeared during state terrorism organized a revolution to find out what happened to their children and grandchildren. So they began to march in 1977 at the Plaza de Mayo in Buenos Aires in front of the presidential palace in public defiance of the government's state terrorism intended to silence all opposition. And because it was mothers and grandmothers, they were successful in bringing about change. And there's a big movement, even up to today, where they're still trying to find their children and their grandchildren. In Iran, there was an Islamic revolution in 1979, and it overthrew 2,500 years of continuous Persian monarchies whose support was supported by the United States. So the United States was for this original regime. And this was replaced by Islamic Republic under the Grand Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini, who was the leader of the revolution. The revolution was supported by various Islamist and leftist organizations and student movements. So it replaced a pro-Western authoritarian monarchy with an anti-Western authoritarian theocracy based on the concept of guardianship of the Islamic jurists. So while it doesn't necessarily benefit the United States, there was a peaceful revolution to overthrow the Persian monarchy to bring about change within their country. In Poland in the 1980s, Solidarity was a broad anti-bureaucratic social movement, and using the methods of civil resistance, they were able to advance the causes of worker rights and social change. The government attempted to destroy the union by imposing martial law and years of political repression, but in the end, it was forced to negotiate with the Solidarity. And finally, in Germany in 1989, after World War II, Germany was split into two countries, West Germany and East Germany. West Germany was democratic, East Germany was communist, and this was part of the concession after the end of World War II. The United States wanted part of, and Western European countries wanted democracy, and Russia wanted communism, so they split the country in two. So they built a wall called the Berlin Wall that was a guarded concrete barrier that physically divided Berlin from 1961 to 1989. So you couldn't really cross over either side. In 1989, a series of revolutions in the Eastern Bloc countries, in Poland and Hungary particularly, caused a chain reaction in East Germany that ultimately resulted in the demise of the wall. And after several weeks of civil unrest, the East German government announced on November 9th, 1989, that all citizens could visit West Germany and West Berlin. So crowds of East Germans crossed and climbed over the wall and joined West Germans on the other side in a celebratory atmosphere. People and souvenir hunters chipped away at parts of the wall, and the fall of the Berlin Wall paved the way for German unification, which formally took place on October 3rd, 1990. So nonviolent protests do indeed work. There was a second wave of nonviolent insurrections. These are known as the color revolutions. And the color revolution is a term that was widely used by the media to describe various related movements that developed in several countries of the former Soviet Union and the Balkans during the early 2000s. Participants in the color revolutions have mostly used nonviolent resistance. Such methods as demonstrations and strikes and interventions have been intended protests against governments seen as corrupt or authoritarian, and they were there to advocate for democracy. These movements generally adopted a specific color or flower as their symbol, and the color revolutions are notable for their important role of non-governmental organizations, NGOs, and student activists in creating nonviolent resistance. The most recent wave of nonviolent insurrections would be the Arab Spring. So the Arab Spring was a revolutionary wave of both violent and nonviolent demonstrations, protests, riots, coups, foreign interventions, and civil wars in North Africa and the Middle East that began in 2010 in the country of Tunisia with the Tunisian Revolution. The effects of the Tunisian Revolution spread to 5 other countries, so Libya, Egypt, Yemen, Syria, and Bahrain, where either the regime was toppled or major uprisings and social violence occurred, including riots, civil wars, and insurgencies. So the Arab Spring has a mixed success rate. In Tunisia, there is definitely it was a peaceful overthrow of the Tunisian government. But in these other countries, it actually, with the exception of Bahrain, it led to civil unrest and violent protests. And in Egypt, we see this with the violent oppression that they're still dealing with today. In Syria, we have the civil war. And in Yemen, we have a civil war that's also raging. So nonviolent insurrection did not necessarily work in those countries that I mentioned. Also, sustained street demonstrations took place in Morocco and Iraq and Algeria, in Lebanon and Jordan, Kuwait, Oman, and Sudan. And minor protests occurred in Djibouti, Mauritania, the Palestinian territories, Saudi Arabia, and the Moroccan-controlled Western Sahara. Excuse me. Nonviolent protests take place throughout the world. And what I want you to do is I want you to leave here with watching an ongoing nonviolent protest in the country of the Democratic Republic of the Congo. So, excuse me, what I'd like you to do is I would like you to watch this video and I would like you to answer the following questions. Number 10, Google Fred Balma. Who is he? Number 11, sorry, I have a tickle. What is lucha? And what nonviolent strategies did they employ? And question 12. Lucha is called a terrorist organization. Those in the governments will vilify nonviolent groups, often calling them terrorists. The Black Lives Matter movement has also been called terrorist by members of the U.S. government. What are your thoughts on this? So, question 10, Google Fred Balma. Who is he? Question 11, what is lucha? What nonviolent strategies did they employ? And question 12, lucha is called a terrorist organization. Those in governments will vilify nonviolent groups, often calling them terrorists. Even the Black Lives Matter movement has been called terrorist by members of the U.S. government. What are your thoughts on this? That ends the screencast. I look forward to seeing you in class. Take care.